bus came closer. "Turn your flashlights off," whispered Peter, peeking over the top. "Get down, they'll see us," Clara whispered as she and Eddie pulled Peter down. "Try not to make a sound," whispered Clara as she peeked over the top herself. Eddie and Peter pulled her down and out of sight. As soon as the bus pulled up and the headlights were turned off, the doors opened and, one by one, the 9 friends stepped out. Because of the terrain was unstable in some parts, Reginald could not use his wheelchair. Pedro and Joey improvised by giving him a pair of oars from under the hood of the trailer attached to the back of the bus. Frank never disconnected the big canoe trailer when he fixed up the bus. They also helped him move, as Reginald was not good at handling crutches. The meteor was about 500 yards ahead of them, glowing brightly. "Okay, everybody," said James quietly once they were all ready. "You remember what to do. Follow me." "Why do you always have to lead first?" Carly snapped. "How about ladies first this time, "What did I say before we left, Catherine?" James growled warningly. "I know what you said. I'm merely reminding you of what I said, unless you think you're smart enough to handle the mission without me," replied Carly haughtily. Growling with anger, James advanced towards Carly, but Christy stopped him by placing her hands on his chest. He tried to protest, but she shook her head, looking apprehensive. Without a word, Christy breathed in and out slowly, and within seconds James followed suit. The others were relieved, even Christy. She may have been a bodybuilder herself, but she was nowhere near as muscular as James. Carly, however, cackled smugly in satisfaction, until Christy rounded on her and angrily shook a threatening finger in Carly's face, silencing her at once. Although the others were apprehensive when James got angry, they were not afraid of Carly. "Right now, y'all," said Christy. "Can we continue with the mission?" "Yes," said James, turning to Carly. "You go ahead of me, Carly, and I'll follow right behind you." "Fair enough," said Carly after a moment or two. As soon as Carly moved ahead, James motioned for the others to follow, with Pedro and Joey helping Reginald with the crutches. They were about 200 feet away from the meteor when suddenly there was a loud whirring noise as the glow of the meteor got brighter for about 5 seconds before dimming again. Carly immediately stopped dead in her tracks. James bumped into her and everybody else bumped into each other. Reginald fell over, and Pedro, Gary, and Joey had to help him up. Shaking and looking petrified, Carly stood motionless, but calmed down when she felt James put his hands on her shoulders. "On second thought," said Carly uneasily, "you go first, James." Relieved that Carly wasn't arguing with him for once, James went forward while Carly stayed in her tracks. The others tried not to laugh or say anything at Carly's situation until James turned to them. "Hold on, everybody," said James quietly. "It looks dangerous, so don't follow. I'll go ahead to investigate. If it's safe, I'll signal for you to follow. If anything bad happens to me, get yourselves out of here. Is that understood?" Carly protested. "But Jimmy, what if you get—" "Understood!" James's voice echoed across the forest and lake. There was a nasty silence apart from the crickets chirping. The others, especially Carly, were shaken by the very idea of James possibly getting killed, but at the same time they knew what a courageous young man he was, so all of them, even Carly, gave in. "Thank you," said James a little sharply. "But please, no more shouting," said Joey timidly. "There are bears around here." "Joey, there are no bears around these parts," said Frank, annoyed. "Shut up, both of you!" Richard whispered loudly, covering their mouths. "There are wolves around here, though." Taking a deep breath, James turned around and moved cautiously forward. The meteor was obscured by a small rocky hill, and when James climbed over it, he stopped and stared in awe. There, standing before him, was the meteor. It was at least 50 feet in diameter and covered with glowing streaks of gold shining in the moonlight. In addition to the crickets chirping, James could now hear a glistening sound along with a low drumming hum, which he assumed was coming from the meteor, as there were no native animals in the area who made such noises. From afar, Eddie, Peter, and Clara were staring in awe at the sight of James and the others. It took every ounce of energy in each of them not to go wild with excitement. After about 20 seconds of staring at it, James turned towards the others, who were looking terrified. Without a trace of fear, James motioned with his head for the others to follow. Slowly but surely, the others climbed over the small hill and approached the meteor. Upon seeing the meteor, everybody was in complete awe. "Whoa," said Richard. "Get a load of this." "Dude," Gary remarked. "I wonder why the meteor's glowing," Frank said. "Where did it come from?" asked Joey. The others turned to Reginald to see if he had an answer, but he merely shrugged and nearly fell over again. "Whoa there," said Pedro, catching him. "I've never seen anything like it," said Christy. "Hoo-wee! Look at the size of it." "It's beautiful," said Carly, mesmerized by the beauty of it all. "Yeah, beautiful," James smiled in awe. At that moment, Carly realized James was looking at her when he was saying it. She blushed and tried not to look too embarrassed, because James always flattered her like this. But she was flattered nonetheless. From afar, Eddie, Peter, and Clara were all finding it increasingly difficult to contain their excitement. Suddenly, without warning, the meteor stopped glowing, and the glistening and humming sound stopped. Everyone froze in terror, especially James, who could sense something bad was about to happen. "Uh-oh," he said under his breath. Boom! All of a sudden, the meteor exploded, engulfing the entire lake in nightmarish light. At the same time, all 9 of them were thrown back, flying through the air, screaming at the top of their lungs. From their hiding place, Eddie, Peter, and Clara watched in horror. A moment later, Clara looked up and her eyes widened in shock. "Look out!" Eddie and Peter looked up and screamed, for a huge chunk of the meteor was coming in their direction. The 3 of them immediately fled, and though the fragment of the meteor managed to miss them, the impact shook the ground and knocked them off their feet. After every piece of the meteor hit the ground, the nightmarish light disappeared and everything went back to normal, apart from pieces of space rock all over the lakeshore, as well as 12 young people laying on the ground. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but some of them looked knocked out cold as they lay all around in uncomfortable positions. In the distance, dark clouds were rolling in fast. After what seemed like ages, but was actually 30 seconds or so, James weakly got to his feet, shaking dirt off of him like a dog shaking himself dry. He stared around, hyperventilating, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with horror. Frank and Joey, laying next to each other, weakly got to their feet. "Ugh!" groaned Joey, rubbing his forehead. "I think I hit my head on something." "Take a lucky guess," snapped Frank, rubbing his own head. Pedro and Gary dusted each other off, then helped Reginald to his feet. Richard, however, couldn't pull himself to his feet, but looked up to see a smiling Christy offering her hand. Richard accepted it, and she helped him to his feet. Then they hugged. Suddenly Richard spotted Christy's Stetson cowboy hat next to him. "Oh, here's your hat, Christy," he said, picking it up. "Thanks, Richie," said Christy, putting it on and kissing him on the cheek. Meanwhile, Carly got to her feet, and, seeing James standing nearby, threw herself around him, shaking uncontrollably. Without looking down at her, James wrapped his arms around Carly. "Dude," said Gary, stunned. "What the hell was that?" No one could speak, not even James or Carly, whom everyone was staring at now. Looking concerned, Christy slowly came up to James and tried to tap his shoulder. "Ah!" To the surprise of all, James leapt into the air like he just experienced an electric shock and fell flat on his back. His reaction also managed to snap Carly out of her shock too. "Jimmy, are you all right?" Carly asked. Nodding, James laid there, shaking and clutching his heart. Carly, Richard, and Christy managed to pull him to his feet. Is everybody all right?" James asked nervously. Everybody nodded, still shaking from the ordeal. Then James turned to see where the meteor had exploded, and the fragments of it scattered in every direction, which were all that remained of it. "Well, the meteor's gone," said Joey, breaking the silence. "So, I guess mission accomplished? Hopefully? Aye, agreed Reginald. Now let's get out of these parts of the Highlands. But we're not in Scotland, Reg, said Gary, confused. It's an expression, Gary, said Frank. La galle bob howdy, Christie interjected. James, your hands! Shrieked Carly suddenly, pointing in horror. James looked down, and to his shock, his hands were glowing blue, and he screamed so loudly it echoed through the trees. The others winced at his reaction. Richard and Joey then listened and thought they heard an owl hooting. There was a distant sound of thunder. Carly, look! James roared, pointing at Carly's hands. Carly shrieked, and when she looked down and saw her hands were glowing now too, except they were pink instead of blue. Holy crap! James and Carly yelled, looking at the others. Within moments they were all screaming, for now everybody had glowing hands. James blue, Carly pink, Richard red, Christie turquoise, Frank green, Gary orange, Joey yellow, Pedro amber, and Reginald purple. Their screams echoed through the trees and across the lake, scaring the birds in the area, who flew away into the cloudy night. Eventually, James came to his senses, and knowing he couldn't make himself heard over the uproar, pulled out his gun. He was a police detective, after all, and fired several shots into the air to bring silence. It worked. Have we been cursed? Frank asked, shaking as a thunderclap sounded. I don't know, Frankie, said James uneasily, and quite frankly, I don't think I want to find out. A flash of lightning lit up the dark night, and the thunder got louder. In the distance, they could hear the howling of wolves. Can we go back to the bus now? Joey asked, looking like he might wet himself. I think that's best, said Carly at once. While this was going on, Eddie, Peter, and Clara, seeing an opportunity, grabbed all their belongings and hurried towards the bus. They managed not to be spotted in the dark and tried to go through the front, but found the door locked. Damn it, said Eddie under his breath. Wait a minute, said Clara, spotting the attached trailer. Back here! Back here! They hurried over to the trailer and lifted up the tarp. Luckily, there was nothing in the big canoe, unless you counted the 2 oars Reginald was using as crutches. There was plenty of room for all 3 of them and all their belongings. Good idea, Clara, smiled Peter. With that, the 3 of them put their belongings carefully into the canoe and hopped in themselves, carefully making sure they covered themselves up so they couldn't be seen. Clara, however, kept a part of the tarp open so they could breathe on their journey back to James and Carly's house. Meanwhile, lightning started flashing more frequently, and the thunder became louder, panicking the 9 friends with the glowing hands. Without hesitation, they all hurried back to the bus as quickly as their legs would carry them, with Pedro and Gary carrying Reginald and the oars. Once they got to the bus, Frank opened it up, and they all scrambled on as quickly but as safely as they could. However that works. Just as Frank was starting up the bus, it began